It's great to return to God, is it not? Hezekiah did that. He returned to God, unlike his father who denied God and did every evil thing against God that could be imagined. Hezekiah chose to honor God and to return his nation to God. He quickly learned that it was not all joy in celebration, however. It turned out it was real work. Returning to God requires us to fight the enemy, if you will. It's necessary to constantly refresh the Spirit in us in order to resist evil in our lives. And there's a term that we use sometimes to describe this battle that goes on. We call it spiritual warfare. You see, the closer to God that we get, the more energy and wisdom that we need in order to resist evil in this world. But there's a flip side to that that's just as important. And that is, the closer to God that we get, the more energy and wisdom we have to resist evil in this world. It's important to know, isn't it? God gives us strength. God gives us wisdom way beyond our own. And the enemy wants us to fall. Evil wants us to fail when we find ourselves close to God. We need that extra energy and wisdom from God in order to resist. Hezekiah didn't just have to work with God on the issues of the day. He had to resist the enemy in order to be successful and to solve the issues that he was surrounded with. Renewing the church or ourselves is kind of like remodeling your house. It takes longer than you hoped. It costs more than you planned, and it makes a bigger mess than you ever thought possible. A good description of what it is to constantly be growing closer to Christ, constantly to be resisting evil in this world. We're in 2 Kings 18 now. I'm going to read you verses 5 through 8. You've heard a little bit of this already. Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. He held fast to the Lord and did not stop following him. He kept the commands the Lord had given Moses. And the Lord was with him. He was successful in whatever he undertook. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. From watchtower to fortified city, he defeated the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory. God's blessing was with Hezekiah because Hezekiah chose to serve God. You remember how he did that? Here he is, the city is surrounded. He can see the campfires of the enemy all around him. And what was his response? Do you remember? He went to the temple, didn't he? And he fell to his knees and he prayed. And he prayed. And with God's blessing comes confidence and peace and understanding. It's an amazing thing knowing that you are doing God's will. A peace must have settled over Hezekiah as he kneeled. Impossible odds. Impossible to defeat an enemy that had gone from nation to nation to nation and had never lost a battle. Always won. They were used to winning. They expected to win. And here's Hezekiah on his knees in the temple, praying. Suddenly, a wash of confidence and peace and understanding flowed over him. When I was first a pastor, I remember walking into the church. It was a church just about like this one, to tell you the truth. My first little church that I had ever served. I was there early, as I always am, and I had gotten everything ready for my very first Sunday as a pastor. And people were filing into the pews, and somebody called out to me, and they said, "Pastor," I looked around for one. I didn't see one. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me, they were talking to me as a pastor. It was a role I had never played before and had no idea what I was doing, to tell you the truth. But it was an amazing thing. As I began that service, I knew for an absolute fact that finally, after all the missteps, the different jobs, the things that I had done in my life, finally, I was really doing what God wanted me to do. It was an amazing feeling to have a kind of peace wash over me, a kind of confidence come into me. I knew that I wasn't afraid of anybody. I didn't have stage fright as I had had when I was doing roles in a play or something, or trying to sing a solo at a concert. None of that happened at all. Instead, I was filled with peace because I was really doing what God wanted me to do, and I knew it. And it felt amazing. It must have felt amazing to Hezekiah to know that he was taking the path that God wanted him to take. And when I say that I was filled with confidence, I want to be clear about that. That isn't self-confidence. That's a confidence that comes from God. It's God confidence. We hold in high esteem self-confidence in our society today. But it's truly God confidence that makes a person know they are where they're supposed to be, doing what they're supposed to do, doing it as well as they possibly can do. Hezekiah learned to take God at his word. It wasn't the size of the army or the level of the threat. It was God's promise and power that motivated what Hezekiah did. The Assyrians had grown arrogant. They had grown self-assured in their many victories over the years. They no longer needed God. Have you ever been in that place where you no longer needed God? It's happened to me so many times I couldn't even begin to count. Not even with gloves off and shoes off would I come up with a good number. Because, it's just my nature to say, that's okay, God, I've got it. I'll take it from here. Right? We all tend to do that. Sports teams are famous for that. In fact, I saw a couple of highly ranked teams fall to nobodies yesterday. The number 2 team in the nation, Alabama, fell to an unranked team, and they didn't just fall, they fell by 25 points. Sometimes we get overconfident, we get self-assured, we have not got God confidence, but we have self-confidence, misplaced self-confidence. You've heard pride comes before a fall. An incident from the American Revolution illustrates what tragedy can result from procrastination. It is reported that Colonel Rahl, commander of the British troops at Trenton, New Jersey, was playing cards when a courier brought an urgent message stating that General George Washington was crossing the Delaware River. Famous painting, you might recall. Rahl put the letter in his pocket, didn't even bother to read it until the game was over. And then, realizing the seriousness of the situation, he hurriedly tried to rally his men to meet the coming attack. But his procrastination was his undoing. His overconfidence was his undoing. He and many of his men were killed, and the rest of the regiment was captured. Norbert Quayle said only a few minutes' delay cost him his life, his honor, and the liberty of his soldiers. Earth's history is strewn with the wrecks of half-finished plans and unexecuted resolutions. Tomorrow is the excuse of the lazy and the refuge of the incompetent. Overconfidence, absolutely certain that you will always win, is one of the things that takes us down. There's some things that tend to get in our way, things like spiritual haughtiness. It's this idea that I'm a super Christian and nothing can touch me, right? Sometimes there's spiritual laziness. We stop being regular about our devotions. We stop being regular about our church attendance. We stop being regular about our prayer life. Spiritual laziness. There's spiritual incompetence. One of my favorite is this saying that you may have heard sometime in your life: God helps those who help themselves. Ever heard that one? Yeah, that's not in the Bible. It doesn't even reflect the nature of God. If you believe that God helps those who help themselves, then that would be an example of spiritual incompetence, I'm afraid. And then there's spiritual contentedness. It's one of those things that is really easy to creep up on us, to be so contented in our spiritual life that we lose track of what threatens that life itself. Verse 7b of what we read, it said, he rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. You know, Hezekiah could have ignored the threat that was outside of the city wall. You remember Nero fiddled while Rome burned? Hezekiah would have been okay. I mean, he was in a fortified city. He was surrounded by guards and gates, and he could have allowed the Assyrian army to take over the entire country, and he would have been okay, at least for a while, in his fortress. He had water that ran into Jerusalem most of his needs were met, if not all of them. But he believed God's blessing wasn't just for him, it was for all of Judah, not just Jerusalem. And ultimately, with the strength of God, he drove the enemy back into their own territory. I can't help but think of Ukraine when I think about that. Ukraine just wants their own land back. They want their own cities, their own people back. They have no desire to invade anyone else. They just don't want to be invaded. The same thing that Hezekiah was facing. During Napoleon's Austrian campaign, his army advanced to within 6 miles of Feldkirch. It looked as though Bonaparte's men would take Feldkirch without resistance. But as Napoleon's army advanced toward their objective in the night, the Christians of Feldkirch gathered in a little church to pray. It was the evening before Easter Sunday morning. The next morning at sunrise, the bells of the village pealed out across the countryside. Napoleon's army, not realizing that it was Easter Sunday, thought that in the night the Austrian army had moved into Feldkirch and that the bells were ringing in jubilation. Napoleon ordered a retreat, and the battle at Feldkirch never took place. The Easter bells caused the enemy to retreat, and peace reigned in the Austrian countryside. Isn't that amazing? To the people of Feldkirch, it must have felt like a miracle. Waiting to be invaded, waiting to have their city destroyed, and it didn't happen. Am I doing that? Waiting to have their city destroyed. It must have felt the same to Hezekiah, to the people of Jerusalem, when suddenly the enemy didn't manage to come in, that they were driven away. James 4:7 says, "Submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you." There was a minister walking down a row of fine old Victorian homes on a cold day when he spotted a young boy on the front porch of one of the homes. The old-fashioned doorbell was set high in the door, and the little fellow was too short to ring it despite his leaping attempts. Feeling sorry for the youngster, the minister stepped up onto the porch and vigorously rang the bell for him, and turned to the little boy and said, "Now what, young man?" inquired the minister. "Now," exclaimed the boy, "we run like crazy." Hezekiah was not content to sound the alarm. He was not content to run for the hills. He prepared spiritually and physically to meet and defeat the enemy. He prepared spiritually through prayer. He fell on his knees in the temple and he prayed. He prepared spiritually through knowledge. He understood the Scriptures. He knew the Scriptures inside and out. That knowledge filled him with hope. He prepared him spiritually by trusting in God. He also prepared physically. He gathered his army. He recruited men. He equipped them with the necessary tools of war, the things necessary to meet and defeat the enemy. He did both. We are supposed to be doing both. See, there's this myth that says, I'm a Christian, all I need to do is fall on my knees and pray, and everything will be taken care of. When God says, if you want to eat, maybe you ought to plant something or go fishing. He doesn't just push the food into your mouth. We're supposed to do both, right? We pray and we do what God's gifted us to do. We do both. We prepare physically and we prepare spiritually. We trust God. We resist the enemy. We overcome temptation, and there's always temptation. and the temptation will be so strong that it will attempt to divert our attention away from what is good and what is right. We overcome adversity. We overcome the negative voices in our life. All of us have negative voices in our life. All of us have a time or a place that we remember very, very well when somebody said, "You're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not pretty enough, you're not wealthy enough, you can't do it." Every one of us has those voices in our head, and they come back to us, especially when we're facing adversity, those negative voices. It's one of those things that our spirituality helps us to overcome. We overcome emotional hurts, losses. We overcome lies that we believe, and oftentimes it's those voices that have told us those lies. I think of the woman who emigrated from Mexico to the United States with her husband and children. On their way to paradise at the border in El Paso, Texas, her husband deserted her, leaving her stranded with her children. Now she's a divorcee, 22 years of age, with 2 kids, and she's poverty-stricken. With the few dollars she had left in her pocket, she bought bus tickets to California. There, she was sure she could find work. She did. She found a job, an awful job, working from midnight until 6 o'clock in the morning, making tacos. She earned only a few dollars, but she ate meagerly, and she saved a dime from every dollar that she earned. Why did she save? She saved because she had a dream. She wanted to own her own taco shop. One day she took the few dollars she managed to save. She went to a banker and said, "There's a little place I'd like to buy. If you'd loan me a few $1,000s, I can have my own taco shop." The banker, impressed by her, decided to take a chance and loaned her the money. She was 25 years old and the owner of a little taco shop. She worked hard at it, and eventually she expanded and expanded until 15 years later, she had the largest wholesale business of Mexican products in America. Her name is Ramona Banuelos, and that's the best I can do. Ramona went on to become the treasurer of the United States of America. Tough times never last, but tough people, they do. Resistance means giving in to God and fighting the enemy every single hour of every single day. We draw closer and closer to God, and further from the enemy. And we get stronger and smarter about resisting that enemy who always wants us to fail. Ephesians 6, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." If you believe that your problem in this world is from a person, I'd like you to rethink that. If you believe that people are causing you problems, that people are the source of evil, I'd like you to rethink that. Hear what the scriptures say about that. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood. It's not against people, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And when we truly understand that, it changes the way we approach every difficult thing in our life. God bless.